Okay, we're going to start off by first talking about imaginary numbers. Now, imaginary numbers are just the square root of -1. That's what the imaginary number is, the square root of -1. It is the number that when multiplied by itself is going to give us -1. Okay? Now, normally you would think that's impossible to have a number that would do that, because if we have two positive numbers, say a 3 times 3, we'll get a positive 9. If I have two negative numbers, -3 times -3, it'll give us positive 9. So taking a number, any number, that multiplied by itself would give us a negative, without the imaginary numbers would be impossible. So this is going to be the situation anytime you are taking the square root of some negative number. Now, important thing to remember about that then is if I is equal to the square root of -1, that means that I squared is equal to a -1. Now that's the most important thing for you to remember here. I squared equals -1. Now we can take any combination of I with an exponent. Let's go ahead and do I to the power 5. And I'm just going to separate it out into an I squared. So there's 2, another I squared. Now we're up to 4 I's, and then one last I. Now, each I squared is a -1. So this turns into -1 times by -1 times by an I. So that's just I to the power 5 equals I. And that's how we're going to simplify a lot of these, is just breaking apart those exponents and recognizing that I squared is -1. Okay, so first we've got this one to simplify. So 3, and then I'm going to have an I squared, so we're at 2, 4, 6, and then only one I to get to the 7. So what that means is I'm going to have 3 times -1 times -1 times -1 times by I. So the answer here is simply -3I. And we've now simplified that as far as it'll go. All right, so next we've got -9 times by I to the power of 10. So I'm going to have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Now each of those is then going to turn into just a -1. So let's see, I had 5 I's. All right, so each -1 multiplied together would become a positive. So positive, positive, but then so we've got 2 positives. We're going to times it by another negative, but the 9 is also a negative. So that negative would come together for a positive, and we just get out of all of that positive 9. Okay, quick way to tell with these is if I've got an even number of negatives, it's going to come out as a positive. If I've got an odd number of negatives, like we had in the first one, then it's going to come out as negative. Okay, in number 6, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives that we were multiplying together. That's a positive number of negatives. So, or that's an even number of negatives. So it came out as a positive. All right, now we're going to quickly talk about multiplying polynomials. Now, I'm just going to use 2 colors for this. Essentially, what we need to do is kind of an extended distributive property. Now, we're used to just taking the number right in front of the variable and multiplying it through. Now, the problem we have here is we didn't just have 3 in front of that. We also had the 5x. everything in our first parentheses needs to be multiplied by everything in our second parentheses. Now, I could kind of do this the long way, and I could show, all right, so I need to have a 5x with the negative 2x, and then a negative 3 with a negative 2x, and then doing it with the 6, and then plus a 5x with the 6. Now, and then finally the negative 3 with the 6. Now, you'll notice that's already becoming kind of a long thing. And that's really kind of a more difficult way to approach this. We can do it that way. One thing you will notice, I made sure that each term of the first parentheses was multiplied by each term of the second. The easier way I'm going to go about it is I'm just going to write my two terms from the first parentheses up here. Then I've got my two terms from the second parentheses down here, and I'm just going to create a grid for them. All right, so now with this grid, my 5x is going to be multiplied by the two others. So 5x times the negative 2x, negative 10x squared. 5x times the 6, 30x. Now, for my negative 3 times negative 2x will be a positive 6x. Negative 3 times 6, negative 18. So, now we just combine like terms. Negative 10x squared, that's going to be alone. We have two x's. We have the 6x and the 30x. So plus 36x plus 18. We've successfully multiplied those together. Here we only have one term in front, and we got a much longer thing over there. We can still do that grid we just talked about, even with that, and I'm just going to put each of these terms in a nice line. Make my box. Okay, so negative 6 times an 8 will be negative 48. X times an x cubed, x to the power 4. Negative 6 times negative 2, positive 12. X times x squared is x cubed. Negative 6 times 7, negative 42. X times x is x squared. Negative 6 times the negative 20 is going to be positive 120, and then x. So now I just write that all out. Negative 48 x to the power of 4 plus 12x cubed minus 42 x squared plus 120x. All right. Now this next two, we're actually including our imaginary numbers this time. We're going to do the same thing. Just set up a box. So for my first one, up here, I've got 9 and a negative 3i. If I can write the same things that I say. And now we've got 9 and a positive 3i. Okay, 9 times 9, 81. 9 times 3i, 27i. Negative 3i times 9, that'll be a negative 27i. And then negative 3i times by a 3i, negative 9, I squared. All right, so let's go ahead and write that out. Now I've got 81. If I've got negative 27i plus a 27i, that's just going to be 0. And then I've got my negative 9i squared. But we should remember I squared is just a negative 1. So that really becomes negative 9 times by a negative 1, which would just be a positive 9. 81 plus 9 is 90. So there's our final answer there. All right, so there's our two terms. 8 minus 10i up top, 11 and a negative 3i down below. Make our grid to multiply this. So 8 times 11, 88. 8 times negative 3i, negative 24i. Negative 10 times 11, negative 110i. Negative 10i times negative 3i, positive 30i squared. All right, so we've got 88, and then the negative 110 and the negative 24, those will give us a negative 134i. And then our plus 30i squared. We now need to remember that I squared is a negative 1, so that 30 is going to become negative 30. And so I can actually do that subtraction. I can take my 88 minus a 30 from it, and I'm going to get 58 minus 134i. And that's as simplified as we are going to get. So this has been your lesson on multiplying polynomials.